Hello and welcome along. So today we're going to talk about Magnus the Red and his time before being reunited with the Emperor and taking control of the Thousand Sons Legion. So Magnus is unique amongst the Primarchs in several ways. One of those is his very close connection to the Emperor. During the time when the other Primarchs were completely out of contact with the Emperor, he was still directly in contact with the Emperor through the warp. So this is kind of a weird situation where he was communicating with the Emperor even before the Primarchs were taken off of Terra. He was communicating with the Emperor when he was in his gestation tank, before he was birthed onto the world of Prospero, before he was even removed from the Emperor's labs. He was in direct communication with the Emperor, exchanging ideas and knowledge and learning about the world and the Emperor himself and what the Emperor wanted for the future of humanity, what he wanted for Magnus, etc. And so he had a much more complete picture of who he was, what he was supposed to be, than the other Primarchs did. When he did eventually get taken away from the Emperor and lands on Prospero, emerges from his gestation pod, he's still in contact with the Emperor, so he isn't as lost as the other Primarch. We don't really know what level of contact this was, how often it was. Did the Emperor arrange a weekly catch up? You know, it's like, Magnus, it's time for your one-to-one. They went out for a couple of hours, walked around the block and talked about all of Magnus's problems. Probably not, but they do seem to have communicated in a pretty unhindered way through the warp, even kind of exploring the warp together as warp entities outside of their physical bodies. And so the Emperor and Magnus had this much closer, unique bond with each other than the Emperor had with any of the other Primarchs, at least while those Primarchs were out there in the galaxy. Eventually, Horus would be recovered, and that happened relatively quickly. And at that point, Horus becomes the Emperor's favourite son. But it's fair to say that maybe Magnus had that closer connection to the Emperor in the earlier days, before Horus was physically there. And this connection seems to have continued on until Magnus was actually physically rediscovered. They were still communicating through the warp. It's almost as if they were going on like father and son adventures through the warp, exploring it, rather than sort of some disembodied voice appearing in Magnus's mind telling him things. It was that they were literally together in the warp, traveling around. So I think Magnus develops almost a feeling that he is the most important Primarch, the special one, because the Emperor treats him like that. The Emperor gives him this attention that none of the other Primarchs have had, this level of understanding of what the Emperor is really about that none of the other Primarchs ever get. And so Magnus thinks, well, yeah, I am very important, and I've got really important things to do, and I'm really good at this warp stuff, aren't I? So I can probably do almost anything. And so this feeling, it really starts very early that he is capable of anything as long as he just learns enough. And that is really key to Magnus's being, is this search for knowledge, this search for knowledge to fix problems. And so he looks out into the world, and wherever he happens to be, and he sees a problem and he thinks, well, I can fix that if I can just find enough information. And that's what he does on Prospero. One of the first things he has to do when he's on Prospero is bring people together to deal with this plague of psychic parasites known as the psychnuons, known as the psychnuians, I think they're called. I can't pronounce it properly. Essentially, they're weird, kind of floaty aliens. I imagine they're about this big, and they inject their eggs psychically into people's brains. Well, into people that have some psychic ability. Unfortunately for the people of Prospero, pretty much everyone has some psychic ability there. So many people have died from this, and essentially their civilization has been turned into a few ragtag survivors living in the mountains on the site that will become Tisca, the capital of Prospero, where the more powerful psychers amongst them are just about able to hold off these parasites. And so a small population has survived. But when Magnus turns up, one of the things he finds out is about this problem. And so he sets about fixing this. Essentially, he pretty much single-handedly brings them together, develops a system for combating them, and drives them out of a wide enough area that the people can start to prosper again. and rebuild their civilization around this site of Tiska, which of course will become in quite a short time an idyllic paradise, a utopian city, which is generally regarded in the Imperium as one of the greatest cities of the Imperium, second only to the Imperial Palace, as an example of a perfect city. And the people that live there are incredibly happy, well-adjusted people that are living their best lives. And that is essentially entirely down to Magnus. And that in itself also feeds into his idea of himself as a kind of a savior, messianic kind of figure, someone who can deliver hope to the hopeless and can fix any problem with just applying knowledge. And it, of course, reinforces his idea that he is capable of almost anything. Now, after creating this near perfect society and fixing this seemingly impossible problem, eventually the Emperor will come along and dump on him the Thousand Sons, who at this point are literally about 1,000 people because their legion has been devastated by the flesh change. And the Emperor, after all these years of communicating with Magnus through the warp, being this kind of perfect father figure for him, having this closest bond with Magnus and exploring the galaxy and the Immaterium with him through their minds, he now kind of goes, well, here's your sons, bit of a problem. They're all dying. No one knows how to fix it. I'm off. And that's what he does. He just leaves him. Then he seems to also stop the communication at this point. When the Emperor was separated by space, there was no way to physically contact each other. The Emperor seemed to put a lot of effort into communicating with Magnus through the warp. But as soon as they are physically reunited, he just kind of abandons him and doesn't really communicate with him anymore, doesn't tell him anything, keeps a lot of secrets from him. And of course, Magnus at this point was always thought, well, I know everything that the Emperor knows because the Emperor's told me everything. He's completely open with me. He will find out eventually, of course, during the heresy or the lead up to the heresy, that this isn't in fact the case and the Emperor has kept a lot of things from him. But he doesn't know that. And so when the Emperor just kind of stops talking to him during the time of the Great Crusade and kind of treats him as just another person that the Emperor knows, and they lose that really close bond that they once shared, that is kind of like the first betrayal that Magnus feels from the Emperor. And of course, he doesn't treat it as that at the time. He just kind of thinks, well, the Emperor's got more important things to do. Now we've kind of physically met each other, and I've got to take control of this legion. I've got tasks to do in the Great Crusade. He kind of puts it to the back of his mind, and it doesn't really bother him. It does kind of lay the foundations of that mistrust, I think, that comes out later in the heresy, when, of course, it's revealed that the Emperor did keep a lot of things from Magnus, and that keeping those things from Magnus were at least partly responsible for Magnus eventually falling for the trap of the powers of chaos. But if we go back to that point where the Emperor has appeared to Magnus physically and has brought the Thousand Sons with him and says, it's your job now to try and save them, and goes away and leaves him to it, and Magnus does save them. He's put in an incredibly difficult position, something that no one has been able to fix, even the Emperor himself, and yet Magnus works out how to fix it. And how does he do it? Well, he gains knowledge to fix it, like he's done all through his life. He knows that if he just gets enough knowledge, he can fix anything. And he does this. He fixes the Legion. He stops the flesh change. Of course, later he will find out that he has been tricked by Tzeentch and that he has effectively sold his soul to save the Legion, and in fact sold them in a way so that they're forever cursed by this problem, this connection to Tzeentch. And the flesh change hasn't really gone away. It's being held back to give the impression that it's been taken away. And of course, it comes back at the beginning of the heresy, or the early lead up to the heresy, and then comes back in with a vengeance at the point of the Battle of Prospero. And this, and as another great portrayal that Magnus goes through, where he realizes he's been tricked this whole time by this being in the warp that he gained power from or knowledge from to fix his sons. Shortly after realizing he's been betrayed by Theman Russ, who has attacked him, as far as he's concerned, without reason. And of course, not long after, he had also recently discovered that Horus has betrayed him and everybody else in the Imperium, all of his brothers and the Emperor. And then, of course, finding out that the Emperor has betrayed him just before that, when he realizes that the Webway system exists and these things that he'd been asking the Emperor about, which the Emperor kind of had skirted round or pushed him away or just simply blanked him on, were all true, and that the Emperor had been working on this project in the background and not telling him anything about it, or even though he was the person that could have most helped the Emperor with this project. Another great betrayal. And they just stack up upon each other. And all of that, of course, all that is compounded by his own shame of being tricked by Tzeentch into betraying the Emperor. He realizes, and it's just too much for him, of course, and it breaks him. It actually literally breaks him into shards, of course, which is another story. But all of that sort of compounding betrayals can be brought back, I think, to that original foundation that the Emperor sets up of building this incredibly close relation with Magnus, seemingly showing him the warp and the universe and existence and all of these things, when actually it was all a lie. It was just a layer of the Emperor, what he wanted Magnus to know, what he wanted Magnus to see, and he was keeping all this other stuff hidden away. And that's really the foundation of the great betrayal of Magnus. It's also the foundation of Magnus overreaching himself. He thinks that he is the only one that can solve the problem of Horus, basically, because no one else seems to be taking it seriously. No one else seems to be interested in it. No one is doing anything except him, and only he could do it. Only he could stop Horus, and he knows that because in the past it's always been down to him. And if he can just get enough power, enough knowledge, he can always fix the problem. Just like he fixed the Psychoneuions, just like he fixed the Thousand Sons. These things that no one else could do, he did it with more knowledge, more power. And so when he's confronted with this situation, this terrible situation, that's beyond anything he's seen before, an existential threat to the Imperium, to the Emperor, to everything he loves, which is Horus betraying the Emperor, something that was inconceivable, he knows that I have to do it then. I have to fix this. I have to get enough knowledge, enough power to fix this. And that's what he does. And of course, it doesn't work out too well in the end, but that's what he's doing. That's where his motive comes from, because it's what he's always done since he was born. I think one of the great ironies of Magnus's life is he basically does what the Emperor has done to him, to his own sons, in Ammon and Ahriman, who are his closest sons. Ahriman is really the first mentor of Magnus. If you discount the Emperor through the warp, he is the person that is the most powerful psyker on Prospero when Magnus arrives. He becomes Magnus's teacher for a relatively short period of time, because Magnus exceeds him very rapidly. But he always remains close to Magnus and becomes his closest advisor, really. And eventually will be taken into the Thousand Sons Legion when Magnus takes control, and will become captain of the Ninth Fellowship, which are the kind of the secret group within the Legion who are responsible for kind of subterfuge and espionage and other hidden activities. And although Ammon will be superseded by Ahriman as the most powerful psyker within the Legion, he still retains that very close bond to Magnus and is really Magnus's closest confidant. And he and Ahriman, at times, advise against Magnus doing some of the things he does, but he can't help but ignore them, because he has this incredible self-belief that he can fix anything if only he has this enough knowledge and enough power. So even though his sons are advising him to be careful, to hold back, perhaps don't go all the way, he can't help himself but to ignore them, because he's like, well, because in the past, whenever anyone has doubted that he could do something, he's always been able to do it. So who are these people to question that he could do it? As much as he likes them, he knows that their knowledge and their power is insignificant compared to his. It isn't reasonable for him to listen to their advice to hold back or to not do something, because they just don't know enough. It's like an adult being told by a 6-year-old, you shouldn't do that because it's a bit too risky. Obviously, you're not going to listen to them. And that's essentially the relationship he has with his sons. It's like, I like them. And in fact, he has a level of respect for them. He treats them better than most Primarchs treat their sons. But he also knows that he's infinitely more knowledgeable and powerful than them. And so they can never really change his mind on something, because they just don't know enough to do that. And or at least from his perspective. And in fact, they do offer useful insights to him, which make him reflect on things, but they can never really change his mind because he just knows too much. And so when you're in the position that he's in, knowing so much, being so powerful, there really is a lonely position. He can't really ask anyone for advice. Even his brothers just don't know enough to be useful to him, to give him advice. And he's actually cautions them against going too far. He's obviously famously cautions Lorgar about looking further into the powers of chaos. So he knows there's danger there. He knows that ignorance can lead to someone's downfall, and he knows that overreaching can lead to someone's downfall. He just doesn't see that could happen to him. So it's like, well, you need to be careful, Lorgar, because if you look into the warp too much, you're going to get in trouble. You're going to cause us all problems. And he's right, of course. But he can't see that in himself because he's above the rest of them. He's like, well, obviously they need to be careful because they are like children playing around with matches. But I am an explosives expert, so I should be able to touch these matches because that's just child's play to me. And that's mainly because the Emperor has concealed the true nature of the warp from him, the true nature of the powers of the warp, the ruinous powers. And so he's missing a vital piece in his picture of reality, which the Emperor has denied him. Now, the Emperor has done this probably because he thinks that he needs to do that, and that maybe because if Magnus knew the full picture, he might be tempted down the path that Horus took, or Lorgar took. You know, he might be doing it for that reason, to protect Magnus. There is another argument that he's doing it because Magnus is actually the only genuine threat to the Emperor on a one-to-one basis. If Magnus truly understood the warp and embraced the powers of chaos, or perhaps not embraced the powers of chaos in the way that Lorgar or Horus do to gain power, but instead harnessed that power, stole that power in the way that the Emperor does and uses it against chaos, perhaps Magnus could exceed the Emperor. Now, what we don't really know about the Emperor is just how much of his power comes from his innate self, who he was when he came into existence, and how much of it is power that he stole from chaos when he made a bargain with them. We do know he did make this bargain and took an enormous amount of power from them as part of some bargain on Moloch that he made, the planet Moloch, which is where Horus goes to make a similar bargain and gain power and soup himself up. So the Emperor without that additional power maybe isn't as quite all-powerful as he seems to be, and Magnus with that power could exceed the Emperor potentially. And perhaps that's why the Emperor doesn't want Magnus to know the full truth of what the warp is and what the powers of the warp are, and particularly their level of intelligence and personality, that it's possible to communicate with them and negotiate with them and trick them and take power from them. Because, of course, Magnus is aware that there are entities within the warp, but he kind of sees the warp as a lower level of intelligence. He sees more like the natural warp predators that will attack you if you're unprotected in the warp, and he knows how to protect himself from that. You know, he's like someone swimming in the sea with using shark repellent to keep the sharks off. He understands that, but what he doesn't know is that there's these true intellects in the warp, the chaos gods. He doesn't know about them at this point, and so that's why he's able to be tricked by Tzeentch. But if the Emperor had let him in on this knowledge and hadn't shielded him from this, perhaps he could have used that knowledge for his own benefit to supersede the Emperor. Perhaps if he knew that the Emperor had made a deal with these beings, because perhaps if the Emperor had revealed to Magnus of their existence at this early stage, he would have been unable to also keep from Magnus the knowledge that he had erased from the minds of the other Primarchs, that he had done this deal with chaos, taken this knowledge and power from them. And then Magnus would have potentially lost respect for him and decided that he should be the supreme leader of humanity because he was a better person, and that seeing the Emperor for what he really was might have done this. And the Emperor might have had that fear, and that's why he kept Magnus ignorant on this subject, which ironically led to Magnus turning against him, because he would set him up for failure. Obviously, this is speculation, but the emperor has a history of making his own problems, usually by not telling people things, and then that lack of knowledge leading to that person making the mistake that the emperor didn't want them to make, and then messing up everything. Horus being an obvious example, Lorgar another. So many times this happens to the emperor, and of course you can say the same about Magnus himself. But the motives for why he kept that information is usually seen as a good one. Like, oh, well, the emperor was just protecting them from themselves because they just couldn't handle it. And that's probably true in most cases. But I think in Magnus's case, there is a reasonable argument to be made that it's actually about protecting the emperor himself from a potential more powerful Magnus. So what do you think? Do you think that Magnus's childhood, this incredibly close bond and close relationship he has with the emperor through the warp, that was the emperor's attempts to control Magnus and keep him from becoming too powerful? Do you think that if Magnus had known the true nature of the Chaos Gods, that he may have struck some bargain with them that could have potentially led him to supersede the emperor? If he'd seen the emperor for what he really was, to have known about the deals that the emperor had made with Chaos, the other things the emperor had done, and was the other things he was keeping from Magnus, would he have turned on the emperor before the heresy? Perhaps would he have sought out this power for himself to take control of the Imperium? Because Magnus is ultimately an idealist, and he would have thought, I can do better than the emperor. I can make humanity's future bright, and I won't make the mistakes that the emperor's made. So if you agree with me on that, let me know. Otherwise, tell me what you think would happen instead. Of course, it's always great to see your comments, and I always try and answer them where I can. So thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and share, and I will see you next time.